welcome everyone to the Responsible Bytes podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things safe and responsible technology. I'm your host, Dr. Zena Assaad, and today I am joined by Dr. Miah Hammond-Errey, a national security and technology expert and the CEO of Strat Futures. Welcome to the podcast, Miah.
Thanks so much for having me, Zena.
Very excited to have you, and I'm excited to chat to you about our current state of affairs. I'm really interested in hearing your perspective on the current state of the technology industry and particularly how this impacts national security.
Well, that is a huge question to start with.
To start on just like a very big mountain.
Yeah, no, let's start. We might climb our way up the mountain together though.
Yeah.
It is, as you know, and we've worked a little bit together, the vast majority of my work to date has really been about the implications of technology for national security and intelligence production. And that in itself is a really big topic. Before we kind of launch into that, I really quickly want to do something which is kind of like set the scene for what national security really is. Because one of the things I've heard you say before is when we're working in interdisciplinary kind of fields, we walk in with one idea, and you were using the word trustworthy, but we can use any term. Yeah. And you walk in with one term, and we're all coming from such different fields. So I do.
And everyone jumps in and says, "That's not what it means to me."
Absolutely. And you're like, well, actually, in my discipline, that is what it means. And then you have to kind of, you come together and work out a plan of what you mean when you say things. And one of the things I think is not as well understood about national security as it could be is that it is inherently a political act to make something a matter of national security. And I'm kind of drawing this out because when I think about intelligence, the national security apparatus, they are very powerful actors in nation states. And it is a political process to deem something national security worthy. And when we come to the technology industry, particularly what's happening in the US a bit later, we'll see how this interplay of when something is national security or when it's in our national interest comes into play and what that might mean for the sectors. So
can you give one quick example of something most people would be familiar with that's deemed national security?
Absolutely. So, for most of our recent history as a country, we have had things like border security or espionage deemed as national security. And then a whole range of other issues have kind of moved in and out depending on the flavor of the day. So we've seen things like immigration, we've seen things like organized crime, we've seen things like cybercrime or, technology move in and out of what is national security. Some people go as far to say supply chains are national security. So you can virtually make the case that
anything
things
is national security.
Right.
But don't quote me on that.
Well, I mean, a lot of people have tried to make really broad claims about everything is national security.
Yeah.
But of course, if everything is national security, it's hard to secure it. And so we have to identify, and thank you for bringing me to kind of a core point there, is what is core to our security as a nation, what is essential for our survival. And in a world where there are lots of complex threats, like many technology threats, how can we actually secure ourselves and our nation and our national interest? And so it's a bit of a theoretical start, but it is important to understand exactly what national security is, because when we move towards talking about technology and the technology industry, it starts to make more sense as to why things are national security threats or opportunities as they come along.
So can you unpack a little bit more for me about the current state of our technology industry? And what I'm specifically talking about here is, I'm going to call it the chaos of the US, but we're seeing these CEOs of these very large and very powerful technology companies become very integrated into a political system. What does that mean for national security?
Yeah, it is a very big and a very loaded question. And I think the reason that it is loaded in many ways is that what we're seeing is highly unusual. Ordinarily in democracies, what we see is a relatively straightforward transfer of power from a losing party to a winning party. And in that, kind of the continuity of functions of the nation state. For those that haven't guessed, I'm a political scientist. And so, I am really interested in the important functions of the nation state, and for those to be continued in the way that they've been established. What we're seeing in the US and the tech companies, or really the heads of a handful of tech companies, have made some large strides into an administration. They are influencing and shaping the way that functions of what were previously only done by government are now also being shaped and influenced by the technology sector in some ways by traditional policy advocacy. So we're seeing the traditional policy functions of technology companies, and this completely legal and normal all around the world, to influence the policies in the jurisdiction they're in. We're also seeing less normal actions, particularly those by
Such a gentle way to put it. Less normal.
Look, I think individually those actions are incredibly problematic, but you need to drill down and talk about what they really are. In the kind of the broad brush, what remains to be seen, I guess, is how the US judicial system responds to actions which do cross that line. So where ordinarily we have, actions of a state or a state function, say, parts of a government administration, which in the US are largely appropriated by Congress, they are then being tested, if you like. The limits of presidential power are being tested. The limits of, organizational change without, legislative remit are being tested. And I think once they're tested in the courts and they either lose or succeed, that's when you can have a real conversation about what that means. At the moment, watching from the sidelines, it just feels really shocking.
It does feel really shocking, and I'm interested in hearing your opinion about why in Trump's first presidency did we not see these very powerful technology companies supporting his campaign? And you did say it's just a handful of them, and it is just a handful of them, but it's the most powerful handful. Let's not forget the technology industry is a huge monopoly, right? And the five big tech companies are the ones who very much are dominating that industry. So in Trump's first campaign and presidency, we didn't really see these technology companies supporting that tenure. In fact, I think it was Mark Zuckerberg who famously spoke out against Trump and established his diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think it was like a group or a process or something within his company in retaliation of something that Trump has said. Fast forward 4 years, and now it's suddenly we're all on board the Trump the Trump train. We're all on board. Yet we're fully happy to support removing this DEI initiative that I originally put in place to counter something that you said. So how did we get to this shift? How did we get here?
Could do an entire podcast on that. And I will say I'm not a US politics expert. So I've studied Australian politics and Australian national security, and I've very much stayed in my lane there. I'm happy to
totally have an opinion on this. This is so public. Everyone's got an opinion on it.
So I think look, I'm happy to share some thoughts on that. I do think I do just want to preface this by saying the Australian system is significantly different for a number of reasons. And we obviously have a political system which is a mix of the UK and the US, and has some unique Australian-only, flavors like compulsory voting and a bunch of other things. So I would just highlight that first, that we are not in the same situation. And obviously we don't have the kind of presidential power, and we don't have the same kind of judicial system. So our Supreme Court is set up differently, so on and so forth. And I think that's really important to understand because we do have quite a different system here. I think in the US, context, many of the tech companies, just take a bit of a step back. Technology power has obviously been concentrating and growing for a really significant period of time. I mean, you mentioned there, that they are monopolies, that they have been, that the power in those industries, and, you and I are writing about it at the moment, and you can go through the things that are fundamental to AI and look at each of them. So when you think about data, when you think about connectivity, when you think about computing capacity, the workforce needed to make those changes, now energy generation and access, the handful of tech companies that we're talking about here, they dominate in all of those fields. And so
They do.
when we start to think about then the kind of the outsized role of power that they play in a market, that is a significant difference from, as you mentioned, many of the other technology players, but also, in fact, many of the other global states, because they have so much significant power and so many others are critically dependent on them for functioning, whether that's in terms of communication, in terms of data, in terms of, compute capacity or workforce. So they do clearly have an outsized power base. What I think is interesting here is the merging of the state and non-state functions. And I mean, I'm deeply concerned about what's occurring. It is also fascinating as a case study in terms of how state and non-state power work, because traditionally we've seen those distinctions remain very clear in democracies. Yes, there's been kind of issues with lobbying and advocacy, and in Australia, we have slightly more stringent rules around lobbying, but it was huge progress that could be made there by restricting, funds towards elected officials and towards political parties. Absolutely, that would make a big difference and reduce their power. But that system is quite different in the US. I also think when we look back at historical, convergences and generation of power, we tend to see people who want power gravitate towards technologies and capabilities that give them that power. And the kinds of technologies that we're talking about here are foundational. They are the control of personal private information. It is changing, AI applications have the potential or are already shaping public opinion. They are shaping what we see, how we think about the world. Even as we start to think about things like LLMs, they are changing or shaping our own communication and formulation of words, our storytelling, our narratives. So they're actually incredibly powerful tools. And so when I think about what's happening in the US, what hits, some of the things that have hit really hard for me have been watching, I recently saw a combat aviator, a female combat aviator who had all of her achievements stripped off the Air Force site because she's a woman.
That's
And
so awful.
those kind of things, and they are being driven by an ideology, which unfortunately is heavily, it is a very strong and dominant theme through the current Silicon Valley kind of tech bro culture. And I think it's not prevalent across all technology cultures. I think it's really important to be clear that we're talking about a handful of cultures here, or a culture that is dominant in a
But it's the
handful of
dominant
companies.
culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It is the dominant culture. And, to your point about large language models, so things like ChatGPT shaping our narratives and our worldviews, it is a real thing. And most people know the way that these large language models work is that they use publicly available information or data, which is basically everything that's on the internet, and they find patterns in that data to respond to your input. And so everybody is usually quite up in arms, I would say, about some of the results that come out of ChatGPT. But what people need to understand is that ChatGPT is not the cause of that problem. The internet has had far right and far left views that dominate, what people see and what people read for a really, really long time. And what ChatGPT has done is that it's simplified our process of seeing those very far left and far right opinions. And for me, I think one of the things that we've lost with not only AI, but the internet in general, and AI has exacerbated it, is our ability to search for correct information. So I see this on social media a ton. Like news outlets on social media will always be like, click the link in our bio to read more. And they give you some kind of, I don't know, really catchy and controversial headline. I wonder what the percentage is of people who actually click the link in the bio to find out more. Instead, they're left with this headline, they make a bunch of inferences from it, and then they start having an opinion on it. And it's a similar thing with ChatGPT. You're getting a very surface level kind of output that lacks depth, that lacks nuance, that lacks intelligence, contrary to the way they try to sell it to you. And so it does shape our narrative and our worldview. But one of the things I think I really want to drill down on is the onus on people. Like, as a person, you should want to have enough drive and sensibility to say, I'm not just going to believe the first thing that's come out of this large language model. I'm going to do a little bit of research, or even just have basic critical thinking skills to look at an output and be like, that looks stupid. Or what was the way you worded it before? Less than normal, or not so normal, or less normal, I think you said.
I think it was less than normal. Yeah.
Yeah. But do you know what I mean? I
Yeah.
do feel we've lost our critical thinking skills. It started with the internet, social media, and then, you know, AI and LLMs really, I think, have exacerbated this problem. And maybe
Absolutely.
it's a case of like a saturation of information. You know, I'm just overwhelmed. This is all I can do. I'm just going to accept it.
I think you've hit on a couple of things there. One is that I think as human beings, we are overwhelmed by the volume of information that we are receiving daily, and we have to triage it somehow. I don't think we've hit on the right mechanism to do that, but
No,
I think
ChatGPT is not the right mechanism.
I mean, no, I definitely don't
Public
think any
service
LLM.
announcement. ChatGPT is not the right tool.
Yes. I mean, contrary again to what some people will try to tell you.
Oh, yeah, they're convinced it's like the tool to triage all this information.
I do think, though, that it has hit a level which is systemic. So I'm going to agree with you and disagree with you. I'll come back to the agree part because I think there's lots we can do about as
start with the bad news. This is why I disagree.
This is why I disagree. Well, it's not that I totally disagree. It's just that I think that whilst individual responses are really critical here, I don't think this is a problem that will be solved by individual responses. So yes, I think they're super important and we can come back to what they are. But I think that it's actually critical that we have government and organizational responses to this problem because we need a systemic solution. The solution to information overload, the solution to, disordered discourse where you've got, as you said, really polarized opinions, and really what it boils down to is a lack of shared facts and a lack of agreement about what truth looks like and how we might ascertain what is true. I think that is a fundamental problem for national security and it's a fundamental problem for society, right? I do think it needs a systemic response. I don't think we're going to get there by individual critical thinking skills, although I also absolutely agree that they're vital. I think part of the problem here is that politicians, by and large, have been very reticent to regulate public opinion or mechanisms by which people can communicate. And when we think back to sort of the advent of the town square, if you like the Twitters and the Facebooks and so on, there was real hope in the early days of the internet that it would sort of revolutionize societies. And we saw in the Middle East, there were actually instances where that widespread information did enable public protest and essentially almost revolution, if not revolution in some places. And so it did have some impact. But then, of course, as that power base shifted and decisions were made about whose information is the right information, what truth looks like, and as we started to see a move towards increasing engagement and time on screen rather than, user well-being, I think that's when we really started to go astray. So when I think about systemic responses, I think, for example, anyone operating a social media platform, for example, should be required to measure user well-being, not engagement, not time on screen, not how much advertising they see, but they should be required to assess how their users are and to have a positive impact on their users. Yep, it'll be really hard. But you know what? They can measure lots of other really hard things. They can identify, how people feel by how they interact with their devices. They can, not necessarily correctly, but they can infer those things. And so I think we would be in a position to make steps towards helping users and user well-being. And absolutely, as you started this conversation, users have to take responsibility for that too. It's not all on systems. I really think, as you suggested, improving people's critical thinking, media literacy, in my last podcast, I interviewed Lyria Bennett-Moses, who's a professor at New South Wales Uni, and you will be super pleased to hear that one of the things she suggested is that high school students have a greater understanding of engineering, of math, of science, an understanding of how different systems work, because we're not just looking at this particular system. As, the next system comes out, students today, they're going to be leaders tomorrow. They will need to understand what are the limitations of these systems. They don't need to understand everything, but they need to understand enough. And, to bring it back to this kind of multidisciplinary engagement, that's why when you and I are talking about trust or power or security, it's why we start with, what do we mean? Like, how are we going to make sense of this particular issue? And so I think, when we come down to trying to fix, or maybe we're never going to quite fix it, but trying to work towards improving our information environment and access to information, communication of it comes down to people sitting in a room from lots of different disciplines and saying, like, how can my part contribute in this? How can your part contribute? And obviously you're going to understand a lot of those technical systems a lot better and be able to communicate to people where their limitations are, what their strengths are. And I wish there were more people like you communicating those strengths, or that more people would listen to your voice, because I think those, your voice and those of others who actually understand the systems in a really technical way bring so much depth to the discussion. I can look at it from a political science, an information environment resilience perspective. But if you and I and others could work together to say, well, how could we measure this? Like, what is technically possible? What's aspirational? How can we reduce those harms? I think that would be a profound shift forward. And I think one of the things that the kind of the broader technology ecosystem hasn't done well is it hasn't shown aspirationally where we can go. It really isn't. I mean, I haven't seen a social platform yet say, hey, let's hold up positive social interaction. Let's hold up improving people's lives.
Well, because that doesn't get traction, does it?
It doesn't make money.
It doesn't make money. What's interesting to me about the things that you're saying is it seems like there's a tension here between users and then the actual developers of these systems. And there is also a tension in the way that these systems are described. So what I mean here is a lot of the work that I do is around dispelling incorrect understandings of these systems. Like AI has a mind of its own and it hallucinates and blah, 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 other dumb stuff like that. And so a big part of my job is saying, no, these aren't correct. These are actually how these systems operate. And the reason that they use these narratives is because they are fabulous, fabulous PR tactics, right? These systems end up seeming very elusive, seeming far more intelligent and whimsical and magical than they actually are. And what this facade does is that it conceals really a lot of the fundamental issues with these systems. And the fundamental issues sit, like you said, at the systemic level. And so by having this kind of elusive facade, it creates what seems to be an impenetrable barrier for people who are not quote unquote technical experts. I agree with you entirely that most people at a surface level can understand how these systems work. It's not hard. It's how I explained it before. ChatGPT trawls through the internet, finds a bunch of information and finds patterns in that information to match the input that you put in. Anyone who doesn't have a technical background can very easily understand that. But these elusive narratives make it seem as though it's like, oh, I couldn't understand this system. It seems too hard. And so what I'm really interested in understanding from you is, we've got these very elusive kind of narratives around these technologies, and we're seeing the people who develop and operate these technologies, so those large tech companies, in very strong positions of power. And I'm interested in understanding the international geopolitical tensions that creates. We're seeing it a little bit with the trade wars between the US and China on the AI chips, but what are some of the broader kind of implications that come from that?
Yeah, again, I mean, another small question.
Just,
um,
don't want to challenge you too much. Just little questions.
I mean, I'm really happy to offer some thoughts. I will say that like it's a constantly moving field, and every day you sort of wake up to a new announcement from the US, which changes the game.
I'm constantly questioning the reality I'm living in, really.
Right. And maybe that's the point.
It's kind of like The Bold and the Beautiful, but I don't know
I was going to say 1984, but we can go The Bold and the
My
Beautiful.
mum was super into The Bold and the Beautiful when I was growing up, and my dad used to always make this joke of like, you could miss 50 episodes and come back and they're still on the same problem.
Yeah.
And I'm curious. I don't know if it'd be the same for the current administration. Maybe not, because every day it's a new thing, but it's got the feeling, the vibe of The Bold and the Beautiful, very
The
dramatic.
Vibes. Yes, it does. Look,
Those
I will
long
agree.
Pauses on people's faces when they're shocked.
It is absolutely very dramatic. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that there are a couple of things playing out here, and you're across some of these as much, if not more, than I am. The first one I would say is really tightly in relation to AI, and it is about AI safety, safe AI, and it has. There was this kind of search, if you like, for safe AI for a number of years, and the UK and the US and a number of other countries established safety institutes. Australia committed to establishing a safety institute, but did not, in fact, establish one. And now there seems to be sort of global uncertainty about whether such network of safety institutes will continue.
Well, the UK have already changed theirs to the AI Security Institute.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes. So as you see, like things are changing. But I mean, as you would know, being across that, we saw a really kind of strong global push for safety from almost all quarters, actually, like almost everyone, and in part because, as is often the case in international diplomacy, when one word can mean many different things, it is easy to agree on. We can all agree that we want the world to be more prosperous. What we actually mean when we want the world to be more prosperous, I could mean I want to be more prosperous personally. You could mean you want a country to be more prosperous, and someone else over here means that they want their country to be able to eat. And so we have three really different views. And that is one of the most confusing and also beautiful things about diplomacy. Often what happens is you don't make global change overnight. You need to incrementally move towards the right place. And hopefully that incremental move gains enough momentum and enough support at the right time that things kind of come together. And it does happen. We've seen globally, many kind of restrictions on things that we are just, as a society, we decide are unacceptable, nuclear weapons, chemical and biological weapons. It hasn't stopped their use completely, but it has absolutely deterred many states from using them. I think what's different, or what's happened with AI, and, to kind of come to where we are now, is that in the last US administration, I think we were moving in that direction. I think we were seeing kind of safety, people coalescing around the concept of AI safety. You had support from a number of the big tech companies, but also many regional players for safety. And
Biden had his executive order,
right, and
which
we
was
had
supported by the technology industry at the time.
Yes, and the NIST had signed with a number, I think Anthropic and maybe OpenAI, to review their systems from a safety perspective. So we had what was really quite significant. Momentum. Right, we had momentum, but I also think we had a number of key players engaged.
Yeah.
Of course, we then had the recent AI summit in France, and I think that was really that was really like the public splintering of global support for AI safety, in the US and UK.
That summit was wild.
I'm glad you're here to describe it in real terms. Yes, it was.
Oh my gosh, I watched JD Vance's presentation live.
Yeah, can you please give it? I mean, you did such a great job of explaining that. Will you please do that here?
Well, what is it called when you post on Blue Sky? I keep calling it tweeting, even though it's not Twitter. I don't know.
Ski? I don't know.
That's a bit, I don't know. Anyway, but basically, so he was huge on deregulation. Regulation is bad and costly and blah, blah, blah. And he was very much for AI innovation. And the thing that always really bugs me is I'm not someone who believes that regulation hinders innovation. When regulation is done properly, it supports safe innovation. Clearly not the case for JD Vance.
And in fact, if you're an amazing innovator, tighter constrictions should create better products. Anyway.
It's true. And if you are an amazing innovator, you want to innovate things that don't harm people. It says a lot about you as an innovator and a developer if you look at a safety regulation and go, what a burden. Do you know what I mean?
I could not agree more. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was super anti-regulation, very much strongly, not even implied, basically said that, we're just going to block users if they regulate us, which I found it to be quite an abrasive way of saying, hey, don't regulate. But I think for me, the thing that kind of killed me the most was he was super big on reminding people that America was leading the AI race, not China. He didn't specifically say China, but he did refer multiple times to adversaries, which I think it was like, I felt like every time he said it, there were these huge quotation marks that came up above his head that were like, China. But the funniest thing for me, because I was watching it live, they were panning to the audience and the facial expressions of the people in the audience were so funny and so reflective of how I think most people feel that it's like, you know what it's like? It's like someone who hasn't worked in a company for 15 years and think that they can just come back and work in that organization again without having been retrained. That's what that presentation felt like. I was like, oh, you've been gone for a long time and you don't know how people operate. And you've now come and want to present to a bunch of people without being retrained.
I love it. It's a brutal and real assessment. Can I add something to that? So
100%.
Where you're going there, particularly on the regulation front, I think, unfortunately, I think all the signs have been there that this is coming from this administration. And I think what we're seeing is just, instance after instance. The latest was the executive order. It must have been, I think it was only last month, which said that if countries, and it specifically named Australia, Canada, and Europe, don't, if they try to regulate big tech or any American technology company, then the US would use any response mechanism, from tariffs to reactive measures to, I can't even remember the full list.
It's so threatening.
What this is saying, and I think this is coming to, coming to your kind of point earlier about harming users and what kind of innovators, I think we're seeing a huge ideological shift here. And that is, tech companies have up until now largely held both things to be true, that we can innovate, that we can offer, exciting new products, but hey, we can also protect our users. And I think there are some that still support that as a base. However, I think we're seeing quite a number, particularly Meta and X, who are moving wildly away from that and will advocate for, anti-regulatory. I mean, they're calling them competitive practices and saying that other countries are not being competitive.
That's strategic wordplay.
Which is, it's a very Orwellian way to describe things. And I mean, the Department of Government Efficiency, also incredibly Orwellian. It would be quite funny if this wasn't happening to a country that we as Australians really care about. This is our ally, and this is watching an ally in a fairly significant state of distress. And I hope that their existing mechanisms will be able to pull presidential power back into a normal state of affairs, pull technology power. But I also think in reality that we have to uphold, as you said, the ideologies that as Australians we want to project into the world. And I hope that those things do have a strong focus on, preventing social harm. And that's why I really back measures like the e-safety office, like our own ambassador for critical and cyber tech, cyber affairs and critical technologies. We actually do have like a privacy commissioner with a lot of teeth and with growing power. And hopefully, we'll get some meaningful privacy legislation next year or later this year. But, I think
one can only hope.
Indeed. I really hope that we see that, because I think that is a very strong projection of Australian values. And I want to see the technologies that I use reflect those values. I think it's absolutely critical. And I agree with you. I believe we can innovate and have great technologies, exciting, new, engaging technologies, and protect users. And in fact, I think if we don't do those two things, we're heading towards a dystopian future that has been written about in sci-fi that I don't think any of us want to be in.
No, I don't think so. And the US doesn't exist in a vacuum. The US is arguably the most powerful state in the world, and it's a close ally to Australia, like you said. So, what are the national security implications for us as Australians if the current US chaos, I'm going to call it the chaos, but if the current US chaos is not reeled in or contained in some way, particularly from that technology standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult question. It's hard to kind of pontificate about futures which have really serious implications,
Yeah.
without kind of falling into, I guess, a challenging place. So I think, I mean, personally, I want to see Australia continue to support America and American institutions to uphold, um, you know, their democracy. If that doesn't happen, I think that we as Australians and as a government need to stand by to support the American people. And I think, as is always the case, if you have a powerful, whoever that entity is, whether that's a president, whether that's an administration, whether that's individuals within an administration, whether that's a military coup, whatever you have in a foreign country, you really need to remind yourself constantly that the people are not making those decisions. That there is a difference between a government and the people of a nation. And I think we also need to remind ourselves of that here at home and in our own region. We have, I think, the greatest strength when we connect people to people. I think that was one of the fascinating byproducts of the DeepSeek emergence in the US, was where a whole bunch of people, when TikTok got banned, I think it was only banned overnight, but all these people kind of
banned for like 10 hours.
10 hours. But all these people, so it wasn't DeepSeek, it was TikTok. It was banned
TikTok,
for like a handful of hours. And all these American influencers joined Red Note, which is a heavily censored Chinese platform. But they began engaging with Chinese people, talking to the Chinese people. And I think actually the best form of global diplomacy at the personal level is to meet people from different places. I don't necessarily recommend doing it on highly censored government controlled platforms, but I do think as the
Make
world
friends safely.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that. Make friends safely. But I do think that one of the greatest things we can do is to promote just genuine human connection with people from different places. And I can think in, going back to, I think why DAI is such a big kind of thorn for me is because I know when I have met people in the workplace that are different from me, I know when there has been diversity, it has improved our mission. It's improved how we get after that mission, but it's also improved the personal experiences we have at work. I mean, diversity, being around people that have different experiences, think differently, look different, have different contributions to make is a really, really significant and important part of humanity. And I think we need to center technology around our humanity and not the other way around. And so I think no matter what our kind of interaction with any nation state, Australia needs to develop a clear and cohesive bipartisan narrative that is about the fact that, Australians care and respect and love each other. We might not love all of us, but we cannot protect just some of us. We are all Australian and we have to protect all of us. And if that means, being more open to diversity, if that means having institutionalizing technology systems that engage in democracy, there are actually 6 foundational principles of democracy, and there's a number of really special practices of democracy that we have in Australia, and almost all of them involve listening to other people, being equal before the law, having representation, like elected official representation, and being able to access that. So there are so many wonderful things about democracy, and I think it's really vital that we kind of try to use technology to nudge us towards a healthier democracy, not a more polarized one. And
which is
really,
what we're seeing in the US.
it absolutely is. I mean, it is a very different system, and it is a very different culture.
It still counts as a democracy, though.
Absolutely. I mean, it still is a democracy. I think democracies globally have been declining, and I think that there have been a number of actions taken towards media and the courts and NGOs and immigrants, which may start to reflect in their annual, democratic rankings. But yeah, absolutely. It's also, you said before, America is the world's most powerful country, and it is. And it is in everyone's best interests for America to be a successful country.
And I think we are feeling it a little bit, but I still don't think we have felt the full ramifications of the flow-on effects of what is currently happening in the US. If this isn't, and I'm not trying to fearmonger, but the reality is that if this is not reeled in anytime soon, there are going to be greater flow-on effects to different nations. And for us Australians especially, of course, it's going to have an impact on us. This is one of our closest allies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right. I think one of the things that we can do is call out, we may not necessarily call it out publicly, but we absolutely need to be making decisions that are in Australians' best interests. And I think there's also a huge place here for globally for alliances with places like Europe, with places like Canada. Perhaps also, I mean, definitely South Korea and Japan, but, maybe also other countries like India and Mexico. I mean, we have to see that the world is changing, global power is shifting. There are signs coming out of the Chinese tech ecosystem which suggest that they have made incredible strides, particularly in relation to LLM efficiency, and so that's really what I think the DeepSeek kind of emergence showed, is that you can there are lots of arguments about how much money it costs to make and so on and so forth. However, it is clear that you can incrementally make models more efficient. And as you said, bloated companies that don't have a financial imperative to do that maybe won't. They're not going to innovate in the same way. And so
they're not. And it's a monopolized industry. And that's one of the downfalls of a monopolized industry, is that it does stifle innovation, because competition fuels innovation. And so when you suffocate competition, there's no longer an incentive to innovate in the way that you would have otherwise.
And so that's what's exciting about some of the Chinese tech players.
And DeepSeek really changed the game. They came in and they were just like, watch us do it better.
Yeah, and allegedly for less money. I mean, that, like I said, that is debatable. But I agree with you.
I believe it because China's got a model of being able to develop lots of things in far cheaper ways, and there's an amalgam of reasons for that. Cheaper resources. They don't have the same worker rights that we have in different countries, so they have a history of demonstrating that they're able to develop a myriad of things far cheaper than other nations. So I could quite reasonably believe that this was cheaper than its equivalent ChatGPT.
I agree with that. I just don't know that the band that they said,
cheaper as they said,
what that
we'll
looks like.
$1.
Yeah, exactly, right. But I mean, I absolutely agree with you. Yeah, I think you bang on that assessment, and I think what it also does by offering it open source, we've seen India and India, Indonesia, and a number of other regional countries open up open source centers based on that model.
Yeah.
I think one of the things, there are significant surveillance concerns around using TikTok and DeepSeek, particularly for Australian officials, but kind of generally the algorithmic control aspect of it is really profound. That is profound in any system.
I
So
just
I
want
would
to
just
point
say
out
that.
here, though, that if you do work in a government role or a role that has some level of security sensitivity, you should not even be using ChatGPT in your role. Just need to point that out.
Thank you.
DeepSeek is not the
Yes.
big bad monster in comparison to ChatGPT. So if you do work in that kind of role, put the ChatGPT down, like put that keyboard down. Write your own
Absolutely.
email. It's okay. It'll only take a couple more minutes.
And it might even be more articulate.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree with that. I think the data collection and surveillance capacity, as well as the algorithmically curated or controlled capacity, like the potential for interference, they're profound on any system.
Yeah.
And that's not even getting to EVs, like that's a whole nother conversation. But I do think they exist and they are real if you're operating on that individual's platform. If you can take it as an open source model, run it on your own servers, you reduce that capacity immensely because you're
You
then
do.
controlling your own data. And so I do think that there is a really clear distinction here, and that's what makes the open source nature of this model really exciting. Yeah, I actually think it could be a game changer for that reason, because it's reduced the efficiency and you've added this open source component. So I'm looking forward actually to seeing what some of our regional partners will do once they take this model and kind of play around with it. And I hope what we see from that is some really niche applications. Because one thing I do get frustrated about with talking about big tech is it then becomes this assumption, although it's true of the infrastructure, it's not true that only the big tech companies can come up with cool AI applications.
Yeah.
And I want to see more people play. I want to see people have fun with technology and try different things. And I think open source models, if we can, as Australia, can provide better data options, better, privacy preserving data practices here, that we might actually be able to encourage people to use applications for really exciting and fun things that we haven't thought about before.
I think this is such a positive spot, an optimistic spot to finish or wrap up this episode. I want to ask you the final question that I ask everyone. What is one piece of advice you would give to people for engaging with technology safely and responsibly? So what is your one responsible byte?
My one responsible byte, I think it's to play safely. So I'm a huge advocate for learning, playing, being curious, and nothing ignites passion for something like trying a new system, playing a new, whatever it is, playing with the technology to do something you want it to do. Ideally in a team, ideally with cool people. But being able to play and learn and be curious helps you to understand the system, helps you to understand the limitations. Hopefully it helps to ignite your excitement and reduce your fear and reduce the effects of other people, as you said, like sharing those narratives which make you feel like I don't know how to engage in technology, or I don't have the knowledge. We all have the knowledge, and those narratives take away our individual power and agency. And I think what we need in this world more than anything right now is humans to have power and agency. Like, we can change the world with small actions and then hopefully with big actions. And I hope that they are responsible and moving towards, better bytes.
I think that is so wonderful. Miah, you have been absolutely incredible to talk to. Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode. And for all of our listeners, I will leave links to all of Miah's details, her socials, her website, everything in the description box. But Miah, thank you again. You've honestly been amazing.
Thank you so much. It was so fun to chat. And I can't wait to publish with you soon.
Oh, yes, me too. I will update this episode for all of our listeners with our book chapter once it does get published.
Awesome. Chat soon.
Bye.